Hello, Julia. How are you?
Hi, Karen. I'm doing really well. And you?
Very good, thank you. Lovely to see you again. So shall I kickstart us?
Yes, please do.
All right. We're going to be talking about authorship, self-authorship, and how we can, in many ways, design our lives rather than just be victim to or in the drift of life. And so we're going to spend some time looking at that. What we're always interested in from an ontological perspective is being able to observe ourselves as well as observe our clients. And there are three key areas that are just part of being human. So the first is language, the second is emotion, and the other is in physiology. And then, of course, the interplay and interrelationship between those three. And so you and I have had many conversations along with other ontological coaches in terms of what is it we're observing that we can help the clients see that might help them shift who and how they are being and who and how they are becoming. And what that then allows for is it allows for choice and a shift in behavior that's not so much based on tools and techniques. With that as a backdrop, we're going to focus on what does it mean for us to be able to start to design our lives and take responsibility. And by responsibility, I always think there's the responsibility with the heavy brow, but there's also we can be response-able. And so this is about helping ourselves and our clients be response-able. So if you're okay for me to keep rolling, I'm going to share an example with a client that I had some years back. And then we can unpack that. How does that sound?
Yeah. Well, Karen, I'm wondering before we do that, if maybe we shouldn't say something a little bit about self-authorship. I think what we're meaning by the self-authorship is that we can get swept up in the, as you said earlier, the drift of life, and we can get swept up in narratives and stories that belong to others. And then we begin to not have a sense of our own being captain of our ship, the master of our fate, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so when we're talking about self-authorship, what we're really talking about is, can I be the authority on my own life? Can I write the script, the narrative for how I want to be, how I want to live, how I would like to lead, for example? Because the alternative is that if I don't do it, somebody else will do it for me. And then I may feel hindered and hemmed in and actually like the victim that you described.
Yeah, it's a really nice way of positioning the experience that my client had that I'll share with you, and then we can unpack it even further. So I was working with this client a few years ago, and she had moved countries, which in and of itself, if you think about it, different culture, so different stories. And in my view and in other people's view, she was a great leader. And hence she had been asked to take over a country lead position in a new place. And she was it, she was the authority in that area, in that country. Anyway, she was remarkable in terms of seeking out views of other people. So she didn't just go in guns blazing and saying, right, we're going to make changes. She went in, she listened very deeply. She spent a lot of time focusing on building relationships, asking people what was important to them, spending time looking at what the strategy had been, getting input into what the strategy could and should be, as well as, of course, talking to people outside of the country about what the organization wanted. Multinational organization, very, very profitable. And the strategy that she had spoken to people, outside of the country, there was a shift. And so for her, it was about how to dovetail the strategy that was being called for and what had been happening in the country that she was in. Anyway, after doing really due diligence, she started to get commitment from people about moving forward with the strategy. And then she found herself cycling. So what would happen was there was agreement on how things would be. There was agreement on the strategy and the implementation of the strategy. And all of a sudden, people started to say, no, this isn't going to work. Lots of excuses, lots of reasons, lots of justifications. She'd have further conversations with them. And so that was what was happening outward. And then in our conversations, what she was sharing with me was how disempowered she felt and how she didn't feel like she could stand her ground. And eventually I asked her an innocuous question. I said, well, I'm curious about what's going on with your voice, because actually I could even hear in our conversation, she'd become quieter, there were body shifts. And she had this huge aha, and she said, oh my goodness, she said, I'm losing my voice, Karen. And we spoke about the power leakages she was experiencing. And I said to her, I said, well, you know, what do you know deeply? And she said, Karen, I know that we've got to shift the strategy. And I know I'm on the right track. And I said, well, how are you going to move forward? What are your decision points? Anyway, and we spent time looking at that. And ultimately, a big part of it came, so there was the organizational link, but a big part of it also came to her was, what was she going to do for herself in standing as a leader? And it was wonderful to hear how she started to have different conversations. She started to make declarations. But what sat behind that was the fundamental view she had of herself. So instead of feeling like she was at the mercy of others, which was one of the other questions, you know, who's running the show here? She started saying, no, I'm going to run the show. And I realized that it might not make me popular, but I have a solid sense of myself that I'm okay with that, and people will make their choices accordingly. And then she started to unfold the strategy and had great success. So that's the background experience, which I think we can tap into.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm wondering if it might be helpful just to unpack that a little bit from an ontological perspective, just to help people watching and listening, what that would, you know, what sense we'd make of that ontologically, and particularly in relation to self-authorship, like how she managed to take her power back. Yeah. So, and maybe, and then Karen, I mean, we're just ad-libbing here, right? So we're meandering a little bit to explore, but one of the things that I think is important to mention, just by way of background, and many of you will have known this if you watched the first intro video, but we're always, as ontological coaches and practitioners, interested in what's going on at a phenomenon level. So I would imagine you would have listened to her story, you know, what she described, and that's really, really important, because one of the aspects of way of being that we pay attention to is, how is this person languaging this reality into being? And how are they participating in that? And now sometimes that languaging may be their own, but it could also be that they take on the language of others around them, which it seems like she had sort of partly done. And what is happening at the level of interpretation in language, because how she was listening and perceiving and understanding things was happening in the process of language. And of course, that I'm imagining would have had an effect on how she was feeling emotionally, and how well those emotions were predisposing her to actually like own that strategy and drive it forward, irrespective of the noise that was being created by others around her. And I would also imagine that physiologically she would have been holding the difficulties when you know of this problem or this issue for her in her body in a certain way, which I would imagine would have shifted too. So I just wanted to put that out there, that we're looking at those lenses, but we're also getting the coachee to self-observe using those lenses as well. Because if they can see it and they can see their own participation in a pattern, they can change it.
Exactly. And thanks. So very much so. So if I start to point to, you know, you spoke about the phenomenon, she had some key assessments about others having more knowledge and more insight than herself. And as we unpacked it, and we started to explore that, she started to realize that her assessments, so her views on how things could be and should be in the organization, carried more weight, and she had a bigger picture. What it did, though, was she started to have a fundamentally different view about herself as a leader, what she had to offer. So she started to see herself as, I have value to offer, and I will be adding that value.
Yeah.
And, you know, to what you were saying in terms of other people's assessments, she could see them as assessments. So they were other people's opinions, and she wasn't taking them on as true or the truth.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't that she stopped listening. She was just able to see that what was going on with more clarity and make choices and move forward in a way that had her feel solid as a leader.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you think about leadership, it is about taking people with you. It is about making certain declarations about how things will be, and living with the consequences. And she was able to do that, which was just magnificent to watch how she was able to lead then. So that's at the language level. And I do want to point to, in the process, there were some societal scripts that she had carried as a woman, and coming from the culture that she did, that she was also able to dismantle, just look at and say,
yes,
I really want to honor this part of my history. And at the same time, I'm not going to be defined by that for the future.
Yeah. And that's really the self-authorship, right? Because the what she had acquired in terms of, let's say, narratives, we call them cultural, historical narratives, but they can be gender narratives too. What she had acquired was not of her making. She had acquired them through the process of, you know, I call it becoming socialized, through the process of growing up, basically, through with societal influences and pressures, whether they be from family, education, gender, whatever. And it was about it, and I think that's what happens with us humans, is that we begin to feel like we're living quite a tight existence. We feel hemmed in by some of that stuff, because it dictates to us what we're supposed to think, how we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to show up. And actually, when we can start to challenge some of those interpretations, those narratives, we start to, as you said, dismantle. I love that word. It's like that starts to, we realize that we've lived in this world that may not have been entirely of our own choosing.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's not to say that, I think just maybe a bit of an existential thing is, it's not to say that we, you know, I'm going to go streaks ahead and forget the society around me. No, it's not that. It's about, how do I forge a path with all that going on, and how do I start to shift that?
Yeah, I always think it's about integrating and expanding.
Yeah.
And it was really lovely to be able to observe her doing that and honoring her history, as opposed to, I should get rid of it.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to moods and emotions, because you picked up on those three areas, and I'm wondering, Julia, if there's anything you noticed in what I was languaging about, and having a guess at what emotions and moods she might have been in, and the shift that happened.
Well, to me, the one thing I wanted to say is that she definitely came from an emotional orientation of seeking cooperation with others, because she was listening. She was not bullish about that. And at the same time, I was wondering, I'm not sure, because you were there, I wasn't, but I'm not sure if part of what may sometimes happen, moving countries and being an outsider, could be a little bit of possible imposter syndrome, which is often linked to moods of anxiety. You know, how am I going to make this happen? What, you know, I would imagine that if she tried and not been able to, and tried again, that there might have been potentially resignation, And how will this ever happen? Like closing down possibilities.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like she dwelt there very long. It's like she was able to go, I will, you know, just that in the language that you described, like when she started to make the declaration, I will make the strategy come alive.
Yeah.
My words, not yours. That was really a mood of deep ambition, and at the same time, perhaps an acceptance that these were the opinions of others, but they do not have to define me. You know, so this wonderful combination, in my view, at least, of a mood of acceptance potentially and mood of ambition around this may be what they think and what they believe. This is what I believe. This is where we're going to go.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So in a way, she was the leader she'd been waiting for.
Super observing, and that's exactly less resignation, but anxiety. And given all that she'd had to contend with moving countries, different language, and the imposter syndrome was there because she didn't feel like she belonged. So we're back to assessments, it's like views she had about herself, and then the linkage. And she was very accepting. So really able to hold that as a base mood. Once she was able to see what was going on and made the decision to shift, came from a deep mood of acceptance and ambition, and just she continuously moved forward from a mood of acceptance. Because I think ambition, you know, people can think, oh well, ambition, you know, then we've just got this, go for it. But it's how do you take people with? And she was really good at that. So we've got a bit of a sense of the emotions, and coming back, that's the phenomenon we're interested in. What's the emotional space of the person, and what moods could they cultivate that could support them in what they want and how they alter their lives. And then let's
Karen, I'm interested. I'm curious. I'm not sure if you want to take it there, but I'm interested in what did you observe in terms of any bodily shifts that she made as she made this transition from the noise that was going on around her to like, yeah, here's the clarity of mind.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go. And it was lovely to see her, because she used to do this, and I used to watch her. She'd be doing this, and I'd say, what's going on? She'd go, what do you mean? What do you mean? I go, like, I'm just noticing that you've made a change. She'd go, oh, she'd open up, because we'd had conversations about it. And initially it was quite stiff. And then over time, I could see her kind of move from here to settling. So, and that was some of what we spoke about, like, you know, what happens when she's here, and she was closed, and the anxiety, and she'd make herself smaller. And then as she opened up, she was able, and she actually moved back in the chair as well.
Interesting.
It was on Zoom, and a lot of her work was on Zoom, and she realized kind of this moving back, breathing, pausing, so that the pace of her speech changed. Her eyes got softer. It was just really lovely. And then how she felt about herself changed. Spoke about muscle tension. So lots and lots of cues that she could then choose and use before going into meetings, during meetings, and checking after meetings. And by the way, a link to that is that her stress levels reduced as a result of the shifts she made.
Yeah. And one of the things, you know, I just like pick up on, as you said, you know, she sort of moved back. And for me, that's really interesting, because talking about strategy, and of course I'm giving my own interpretation here, may not have been what was going on for her, but is that actually as a senior leader, as you've described her, she would have needed that to be able to see the landscape around her and the horizon she was going towards.
Yeah.
Which if you're doing this, you're not able to. So in a way, you know, we just in this work, the body has got such such an immense role to play in the shifts that are being had. And I think that settledness that you described is also this it's almost like she settled into the ground of her own being. Yeah.
So a wonderful way of describing it. And so if we just link back, Julia, to the self-authorship that we started with, and perhaps, you know, so as I said, it's about who we are being and how we are being and who and how we are becoming. And while this was linked to a coaching conversation, what then started to shift were other aspects of her life. So in her family, what she wanted, what she was willing to ask for, what she was willing to say, and the kind of conversation she could have. And this is, you know, I think you made some great points about self-authorship. Is she started to say, I have the pen in my hand. And of course, there are parts of life that we just in it, we just go with it. And there are parts of life we can design. And so she became exquisite at designing what she wanted, both for the organization as well as in her own life.
So fantastic, Karen, because it's this idea that, you know, if we don't do that, if we're not going to pick up that pen and write the script, and sure, we're not guaranteed it's going to go according to our script, but if we do not have that intentionality and supported by our moods and emotions and our physiology, we're going to be like a cork bobbing on the ocean, on the tides and waves. You know? So it's wonderful. It reminds me of that poem that was one of Nelson Mandela's favorite poems, Invictus. And in fact, the movie that was made about him, played by Morgan Freeman, about the Rugby World Cup in 1995, has that poem narrated in it. And it's at the end it says, you know, something about my head remains bloody but unbowed, and I'm the captain of my ship, I'm the master of my fate. And I think that's really the sentiment that we're talking about when we talk about self-authorship, is that we start to, I always like to say, we're co-creating with the process of life rather than being a victim of it. And I would make the assessment that leads to a big sense of I'm enjoying a quality of existence that is partly at my hand. You know. So it's fantastic. What a wonderful story. And maybe, you know, if we're just wanting to say as well that this approach has fairly robust theoretical underpinnings, and one of them is a branch of philosophy which is to do with existential philosophy and also phenomenology. So we make it very clear in our approach that we don't get stuck in any story, but that we're listening to that for what it's telling us, and we're listening also at the much deeper level what's really going on here. Which is what makes this approach as transformational as what it is.
And with that, where the shifts lie. So
and these shifts are transferable, Karen. So what she'd enjoyed with what she'd learned from the coaching in the professional space, she was able to transfer into another big area of life, the family zone.
Well, and I think that is the thing, is that there are lots of approaches that offer tools and techniques which can be fantastic and really useful. However, if there isn't a shift at the level of our way of being, then the tools and techniques, you know, it's a bit like shooting arrows into the sky and they go nowhere. Well, I think that we've probably out of time together. So thank you for a wonderful conversation. And it will be great if there are people who are listening. Love to hear from them what they make of what we've shared, and how they might apply what we've shared in their own life.
Thanks, Karen. Always enjoyable.
Yeah. Go well.
You too.